Hi, Greg.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. You're looking very zen today. And that's as it should be, because let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of The Wright Show. This is Meaning of Life TV. You are Greg Snyder, an ordained Zen priest, for one thing, but also executive director of the Brooklyn Zen Center, which you co-founded about 10 years ago. You're also on the, Brooklyn Borough President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Community Partnerships. And you do a lot of work in the Brooklyn community, including working with young people in the schools and teaching them how to meditate and stuff like that. And I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about meditation itself and distinctively Zen meditation and what distinguishes it from other traditions, what you get out of it, and we may even get into some heavy philosophical concepts if we're not careful.
Okay, great.
So for starters, why don't you talk a little about the work you're doing in the schools there? I gather this is mainly teenagers?
Yeah, teenagers. I want to make one quick correction only because it just happened. I'm no longer the executive director. We just hired a new executive.
Was there a coup? Was there a Zen coup?
There was a Zen coup. New ED took over, so I'm just on the teaching side now.
Okay.
But in terms of work in the schools, I guess it's 5 years ago now, we started working with public schools and bringing meditation and mindfulness into the schools themselves. It started because I personally was contacted to see if meditation might help with some anger stuff that was going on with some of the young people, which was interesting for me because what brought me to meditation was anger. So I had my own personal experience. So we tried a few things, and young people responded, and it took off, and soon it formed Awake Youth Project, which is now our teen program there. But we do a couple of things. We go into the schools, and we do after school sits that people come to, and usually we're in partnership with other nonprofits that do the recruiting within the schools, and they bring the young people there. We also have our own drop-in program at the Zen Center itself, and then we also do professional development with teachers and social workers and other people working in the schools that work with students directly.
Now, are the kids, mainly kids who just decided they'd like to try meditating, maybe because they decided they have an anger issue, or are they sometimes identified by the school administration as somebody who has an anger problem, or what?
Well, they come for all kinds of reasons. Some come because they're struggling with anger. A lot of people, some come because they're struggling with stress. It just sounds interesting to them. But usually they decide to come. We have tried a few programs where it was an alternative to detention. Somebody who was facing detention might instead decide to go to one of our classes and try that out and see if that helps with the reason that brought them into detention. Those have not taken off, not because they weren't successful, but because it's just a lot of work to administer it, and most of the principals in the public school system in New York are so overwhelmed that they just don't have a lot of time to focus on it. But I would say it's a mix of people choosing to come and then teachers suggest that some students come. Definitely social workers suggest that some students come. So but we've never had anybody that had to come for any reason.
So before we get further into that, do you want to talk a little about how anger brought you into meditation?
Sure.
And when was this?
This was... Let me see, I was 28 years old, so I guess that was about 1997-ish. When I was young, I had a particularly sometimes volatile family, and some rough stuff in my childhood. So what came out of it was my script was pretty shame-based, and I had I just had a lot of rage. And I struggled before practice. I struggled a lot with substance abuse and any number of things. But at one point in time, I there was this incident that happened that I call the garbage bag moment, where I was trying to take garbage out of the house. It's a very simple situation, but the garbage bag broke, and I just started internally screaming at myself, "You idiot!" Da da da, any number of words coming out, and I went into a rage. And I did what I commonly did at that time, which was throw things, except this time there was no one else in the room. There was no one to blame it on. And so a thought came up in my head at that time, which is, if you don't take care of this, you're going to be dead by 40. Actually, the thought I had is you're going to have a stroke by 40. Mm-hmm. So around that time, and I can't remember if it was just before or just after, I was reading Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And something sounded right. So I found a sitting group. At that time, I was in Austin, Texas. I found a sitting group, which at that time was the burgeoning Austin Zen Center. And I sat a few mornings, and then I just didn't stop. Mm-hmm. And that's what brought me to practice. So
you had anger issues, but also in particular anger directed toward yourself.
Yeah, a lot of anger toward myself, and it came out as anger toward others.
Yeah, it's funny how it works that way. I can kind of relate to both of those things, actually. Yeah. And so, Zen, did it help right away, or?
Well, what happened was about 3 months in, I think it was about 3 months in, I sat my first 5-day retreat. Mm-hmm. And I spent most of that retreat in an impressively steady state of rage. But the fourth day, it stopped. Mm-hmm. And that's when I saw it stop, when I saw it come to a close, I thought, I don't know what's going on here exactly, but it's working. I mean, there was this breath. It's like I could inhale for the first time in years. And so in that way, yeah, it started helping pretty quickly. It took many years to get to the many roots of what caused that behavior. But yeah, it assuaged many things quickly.
And during the rage part of the retreat, were you mad at yourself in part for failing to successfully meditate? That's a favorite of, during my first retreat, that was a favorite theme for the first 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, I'm sure that was mixed in there, but I was mad at everything. I was mad at, in Zen you have this very elaborate eating ceremony called oryoki, which is very slow to serve and all kinds of ritual and detail. And I remember just being so angry at those sermons, and so yeah, I was probably angry at myself and everything else that moved.
Okay. Now, you mentioned mindfulness in talking about what you teach these teenagers. Yeah. That's not, mindfulness isn't the first thing you think of when you think of Zen. I mean, Zen, there's a particular meditative instruction that I most associate with Zen, at least, which is different from what I think of with mindfulness meditation. Am I wrong in that apprehension? I think of Zen's instructions as, in a certain sense, less specific.
Right. I would say, I mean, I'm kind of using the word mindfulness because that's the common parlance right now. But right. what I would say that Zen really focuses on is attention to everything being what we're doing at any given time. So a kind of attention that is non-dualistic with everything we're doing. So all the cliches of Zen. When you're washing the dishes, just wash the dishes. Right. The chop wood, carry water, Soto Zen style. So that's what we bring to young people, is what is it to just be with what you're doing? And then if you can't, what's going on that you can't? Right. What are the stories you're telling yourself at that moment that you're beating yourself up or angry at yourself for not being able to meditate well? Okay.
So in kind of classic mindfulness meditation, I guess the specific instruction involves, well, first of all, focusing on your breath enough so that you establish some kind of stability of mind and you can focus on things. Mm-hmm. And then after that, the idea is that when certain feelings arise, whether anger or anxiety, you would look at them maybe more clearly than you ordinarily would, and in a certain sense with more dispassion or at least less attachment. Is that what you tell the teens? Do you give them that kind of specific instruction about anger, for example?
Yeah, with Zen, we really do the same thing. Like if somebody comes into a Zendo, I'll answer that both in terms of the teens and then just coming into a Zendo as a regular sitter. If somebody starts meditation with us, we do the same thing. We bring them to their breath. We tell them to bring their attention to their breath, usually at the deepest point in their body, and then they let their attention rest there. And then they stay with their breath. For the reasons you mentioned, you have to build concentration to a point before you can, the end goal with Zen is what we call shikantaza, which is this very wide awareness. But that's not something, and it's very undirected and it's very nonspecific. Mm-hmm. But it's not something you can just usually sit down and fall into. Usually the mind's running all over the place. So we start very much the same way as most of the schools in Buddhism, which is you concentrate the mind on the breath. Mm-hmm. In terms of the dispassionate observer, it's an interesting thing because people go different ways with this. That with teenagers, the instruction, and really the instruction I think that's quite common, is to be with the anger as it's arising, but not identified. Mm-hmm. So there's both a quality of not being invested in it and not separating oneself from it at the same time. So in that way, that's exactly what we do. So young people can feel, they start to move back the arc of a lot of times when we start with them, they don't know they're angry until they're acting out. Mm-hmm. Right. That's when they know. So it's starting to move back that causal chain until they can start feeling the arising of the anger before they act on it.
And you alluded to this kind of irony, I think, that yes, sometimes getting closer to the feeling, like a feeling like sadness or anxiety, you normally are actually kind of trying to distance yourself from, because but kind of accepting it, and in that sense getting closer to it gives you what could be described as a more objective view of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Would I use the word objective? I would. Most certainly what you're describing is my experience and the experience of a lot of people, which is the more detailed. Yeah, the closer we get to it, the less we resist it, the more detailed experience we have of it, the less we're moved around by it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, the less we're moved around by it.
Yeah, you're less controlled by it. Yeah. So I gather you have a reasonably high success rate with these students, and it probably depends partly on their motivation and things like that. Have you kind of learned anything about kids today? I mean, they're growing up in a different environment, certainly than I did, and even than you did. And you hear these days about how different things are with social media, hookup culture, everything. Are you finding that they are facing fundamentally different kinds of issues than the kinds you face, or is it just kind of the same old story?
I think everything's earlier and maybe more intense. I don't know if the issues are fundamentally different, but I think they're facing them at a younger age. I don't think that they're children very long. By the time they're 9 and 10 years old, they're dealing with things that I didn't think about until I was 13. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of violence in the neighborhoods of the kids that we work with, so that's something that's very real for them. I remember the one more than once I would open a group with what shakes you out of the present, or what brings up fear that takes you away from being present with yourself, and people would say hearing gunshots on the street. So that's something that's a part of. I did not worry about gunshots on the street. Mm-hmm. I grew up in an area where the only gunshots you would hear were deer season. Mm-hmm. So that is that is different for them. That's an urban climate that is hard. So they have a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's a lot of I would say paying attention to it. A lot of them are raising their younger brothers and sisters. So there's a lot of being an adult way before their days. Mm-hmm. That I think is just it's tough on them. Mm-hmm. Not really tough on them.
And what is the range of outcomes that you would describe as successful? In other words, maybe there are some who have become deeply immersed in the practice and aspire to be priests at one end of the spectrum or something, and then, with others, maybe stick with it for a while. They're better people, or they stick with it for a longer while, but in a kind of modestly therapeutic way, as opposed to getting deeply into Zen. What kinds of specific outcomes do you see?
Well, one of the first things we do, we're very clear that the reason we're doing this is for transformation. Mm-hmm. So that's out of the gate.
So this is not just mindfulness-based stress reduction kind of approach that some people.
Not at all. It's secular. We don't use Buddhist language, but in the very first meeting I have, usually we would meet, and now other people are running this program more than I am, I should say, because there are many more people involved. But when I would start with a group that would say meet over a semester, one of the very first time we would meet, we would focus on thought, and I would ask them where did their thoughts come from, and they would lay out all of these things: parents, commercials, etc. And they would say, and I would say, well, it doesn't sound like any of them came from you, that they all came from somewhere else, and that they're all inherited. And they would have come to that agreement, and then I would ask a simple question: then why do you believe them? And that froze the group, and consistently freezes the group every single time, because they've never even had the thought that their thoughts shouldn't be believed. And so that, to me, and the reason I say this is because the two things that I want every young person to learn right out of the gate is that they don't have to believe their thoughts. That's a choice. And the other one is that when they see an emotion unfolding, there is an option to stop, go to the breath, and let it happen without acting. If they can get those two things, they're good. The rest, that starts a process. That starts a karmic process that is only going to be better than the one that was happening before. Because now there's options that weren't there before. And so I've had people come to 2 meetings. One meeting where they heard these 2 things, and the next meeting come back, a young woman said, I was about to get into a fight. I thought about what you said, that I didn't have to believe that I was dissed, and then I stopped and breathed for a second. I didn't get into a fight. That's one time into a class. So is that person going to become what we call a practitioner? Probably not. But are they going to remember that that's an option? Probably so, because they've already learned it. So that's information. Now, that's one end. The other end is we've had people who were in Awake Youth for 3 years, from sophomore to to senior year, and graduated. They're still practitioners. They're still sitters. One started a sitting group in a college. Others come and sit 5-day retreats at Zen Center. So we've had people go into being practitioners. Nobody becoming priests, but going in being practitioners. So. And sometimes some of our 16-year-olds have sat 5-day Zen retreats. So,
and is it a program with a specific duration? Like you either stick with it and kind of say you've completed it, or you don't, or is it just kind of something that's there all year? You drop by when you want.
It is a drop by for most, but we have an option that's called peer-to-peer training or peer leadership program. And those young people, those are the ones who really are interested, and they commit to multiple years, and they get a lot more attention, and they work more closely with, for example, Beatrice Anderson, who's the current program director. She works very closely with the peer leaders, and then they in turn, once they have that for a year, they in turn are leading the next year's group. And with the support of the staff, but they're really in charge, and they're really bringing meditation and these practices to the next generation, or the next wave of kids coming in.
And about how many kids come in contact with the program in a year?
I would say maybe, we've had a quiet year this year, but I would say on average 200 to 300.
That's good. That's good. So why don't we talk a little about Zen philosophy, Zen meditation, as distinguished from other other branches of Buddhist thought and practice. There are a lot of them. I mean, I think some people don't realize how varied they are. I think ultimately they have a whole lot in common in terms of meditative experience and philosophy. But I think one kind of distinction that's, of course, commonly made is between Theravada Buddhism on the one hand, Mahayana Buddhism on the other. Zen is generally lumped with Mahayana. Theravada more associated with Southeast Asia, probably. Both of them have come to the United States and in the process been altered perhaps and evolved along distinctively Western and maybe more secular paths in some cases. It seems to me like the original, like Zen hit the West Coast in kind of the 60s. Is this an oversimplification? And then kind of Theravadan, and in particular Vipassana, kind of hit the East Coast in the 70s. Does that sound wrong?
That's my understanding.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, now they're both floating around.
I mean, D.T. Suzuki was at Columbia, so he was on the East Coast.
He was.
But in terms of what I think you're referring to, which is people actually practicing,
right?
I would say the West Coast is still the stronghold of Zen. You know, that's where it came out of San Francisco and L.A. mostly. Yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, there are two big philosophical concepts in Buddhism. Well, more than two, but one is the idea of not self, that the self does, in some sense, does not exist. Another is emptiness. At least that's the way the term sunyata has come to be translated, and that's about the actual nature of observed reality, and the idea that as you typically observe it is in some sense a misleading picture of it, and this emptiness idea better captures the actual nature of it. And my sense is that although you certainly find both of these ideas in Mahayana, and I think you kind of find both of them in Theravada, although you don't hear the term emptiness as much in Theravada. I think you find kind of both ideas, but my sense is not self is more emphasized in Theravada, or at least Vipassana, and emptiness more in Mahayana. Is that your sense, or am I?
I think that's true, but I think you have to break down what you mean by not self.
Right.
So, and whether we're talking about the same thing, because an Atman can be talked about in many, many ways. If you talk about the three marks of existence, there's a very interesting thing about what they're referring to. So we talk about
so those being not dukkha, self, suffering, yes. Not self, and what, impermanence or
impermanence. But dukkha, but impermanence and suffering refer to what's written in the Dhammapada is that the word used for both suffering and impermanence is sankhara, which means basically is the word for karmic. One way you could say is karmic accumulation, that's good. But if you look at when they say anatman, they don't use that word. They use the word dharmas.
And anatman means not self.
Yeah, not self. They use the word dharmas, and that's a much broader philosophical category than sankhara.
Doesn't that mean kind of things?
Everything.
Yeah.
Essentially everything that's arising.
Yeah.
So if you're going to say that everything that arises has no self, then you're talking about emptiness.
Right. I mean, that's one way to look at this, is that there's the idea of not self, that you don't have a self. And then there's the idea that nothing else you see has a self, although maybe for inanimate objects, a better term for that is an essence. Nothing, we kind of tend to think of things like that. Okay, that's a lamp. It has essence of lamp. Right. That's the way cognitively we just kind of naturally categorize things with a kind of a filing system where we have a label for them. And sometimes, I mean, they give us kind of distinctive feelings according to their label. I mean, dog, cat, we have these reactions to them. And so in a way, what we call emptiness is the idea that it's misleading to think of anything as having an essence, anything out there. And that's just kind of an extension of the idea that it's misleading to think of you have an essence or a self.
Right. I mean, the simplest way that I would describe the notion of emptiness is that nothing has a boundary or a core.
Right.
That's just, there is that boundaries and cores are imposed.
Right.
And if we invest in boundaries and cores to things, we'll suffer because we'll want them to be permanent and they won't be. We'll want them to be stable and they can't be. And so we'll fix our minds on that kind of world that simply isn't there.
So well, go ahead. I was going to say, so it's partly about interconnection. I mean, the idea that boundaries are not as important as we think is partly a way of saying that everything interacts with other things. In the case of yourself, it's a way of acknowledging that, whereas you think of yourself as like autonomously generating all your behavior, like I decide, blah, blah, blah. But in truth, you're always reacting to input, and your tendencies have been programmed by early input and so on. So it's a much more, it's such an interactive system that ultimately it doesn't make that much sense to think of this chief executive in your head that's doing all this stuff. And then out in the world, same thing. Everything's interdependent. So that's kind of the philosophy.
Right.
Talk about, you're, I'm sure, a much more accomplished meditator than I am, which is something that many meditators can say. Talk about the experience. I mean, the interesting thing about Buddhism is these ideas have this well worked out philosophy, but then there's this experiential side of them. The idea is you can actually experience them through meditation. Do you want to talk about the experience of emptiness? It's hard, of course. It's hard to talk about these things.
No, I don't. It's not that I consider it difficult. It's more a consideration of skillfulness. I mean, it is, for me, the experience is one that that is, to put it in the same language, that there's no there to things. That you see that the mind is actually imputing. You can see you can feel the energetic insistence of the mind that things be what the mind is saying they are. And once that's seen and the way it's overlaying everything, it can quiet down and break, if you will. That process can kind of crack, or it can break open. And it's not that the mind still doesn't say chair. Of course it does. And it's not that the mind doesn't see the world as conceptual. Of course it does. But the insistence that it be a permanent, definable thing that you can grab onto falls away. So in a way, the realization of, for me, the realization of emptiness is a falling away of the volitional character of the mind, in that the world must be the way I'm talking about it. It must be that way. And that falls off. And then also, I think there's a very, over time, what matures is a sense of the world that is a word we don't use much in Zen, but a word that I'm coming to feel is quite accurate, is the spirit of existence. That through all things is some ineffable quality of life. And that we can't feel that as long as we're superimposing on everything.
Yeah, I've heard this from some very accomplished meditators, that there's a sense of kind of continuous energy permeating things or something.
Yeah.
Which I take to be kind of what you're talking about. There's, an experience I've had, I guess particularly on retreat, that I kind of think may be related to emptiness, or maybe result from attaining a modicum of emptiness in via meditation. But it is that it's naturally paying attention to details of things you don't normally notice, like, the bark of a tree, and you also notice how beautiful it is, maybe, but the point is you notice it in the first place. And I think that's partly because you're not relying on your filing system. I mean,
Yeah.
the labels, what labels are for largely is to help you ignore things.
Yes, that's true.
Right. I mean, that's just a tree. There's
Yeah.
nothing. A tree has no relevance to me today. I want to go. I want to eat. I want to accomplish this. I want to accomplish that. I'm tree. It's a tree. So long. So there's a. I think that's. I mean, does that seem to you related to the idea of emptiness, being drawn more into the details, the textures, and things?
Yeah, I actually, I think that emptiness is just a negative way of, and I don't mean negative value-wise, I mean just negative in that we're taking away instead of adding. That emptiness is a negative way of talking about dependent co-arising. I mean, if you take away, which you suggested earlier, if you take away boundaries in core, what do you have? You have flow. You have everything flowing in and out. And it's not to say that these ideas of boundaries are not useful. I mean, I want to know what a pencil is and be able to pick it up and actually physically grab it. So seeing boundaries is useful. But the intuitive sense that the boundaries are actually not the whole truth, and that's kind of a felt intuitive sense. I do think that what you're talking about is kind of a byproduct, which is this emergence of beauty. Suddenly everything is quite beautiful and detailed and lovely. You're paying attention.
And the focus on qualities of things rather than necessarily the thing as a whole, in a certain sense. I mean, there's
well, the whole is a construct.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So there's only qualities.
Right. So there's only qualities.
Just your experience. There's the experience of what's going on. So yeah, if you're not, as you eloquently put it, and if you're not going around kind of killing things with concepts and categories, then it's you start to experience life. And
the phrase you just used, dependent co-arising, it's kind of a technical term, but it basically refers to the fact, I guess, that nothing can exist in truly independent fashion. A tree cannot exist without absorbing light and water and so on. Nothing in the world that we see, so far as we know, could exist in a truly self-sufficient fashion.
Right. Everything's causally interrelated. Yeah.
So, do you find that the experience of not self tends to naturally accompany the apprehension of emptiness when you're in a meditative state, when you're meditating?
Well, I don't know about meditate. I mean, meditative state.
I could withdraw that phrase if you'd like.
No, it's fine. I'm just trying to think how to word this. Does not self go along with emptiness? I think that they are related but different insights. So one can see not self is kind of, if one can see through many ways that the self is not permanent and definable. And people have that experience in a lot of ways. I mean, some people have it actually through the heart. They have a big bodhicitta, a very large love experience. And and I don't mean love in the emotional sense. I mean, what comes forward is the heart's recognition that there's no separation. And that recognition can start to erode at any feeling of a separate self. Other people can have a very kind of strict old school Buddhist style thing where they see that the aggregates of the mind or perception and sensation and these things are self-clinging in a way. They're grasping themselves. And they might see those aspects of mind kind of fall apart. And when that happens, then that experience starts to erode a sense of separate self. The experience that all concepts are empty of own being, that could begin to erode an experience of separate self. I wouldn't say that any of them, although for a very few people maybe, that any of them snap off self. You know, separate self is a very dynamic process, and it's a lot of karmic habit patterns moving along together. And even if some of them drop away at the moment of a realization, many of them do not, and they take some time to work themselves out. One way that I often think about it is, if you have a revolution a revolution happens in a state and the capital falls, right? It takes a long time for those small towns to know that there's nobody running the government. They're still acting like somebody's running the government. The horsemen have to get out there, you know, and that's not dissimilar from what can happen for people who have kind of a cataclysmic experience. Something can really fall away, but that doesn't mean every single unfolding karmic pattern's got the message. Especially if we've repressed a bunch of them because they're traumatic or whatever. They're really not going to get the message. They're kind of in la-la land. They're off in their own world. Okay. So.
Now, what's the term you mentioned that refers to kind of wide awareness?
Shikantaza.
Shikantaza.
Yeah.
Now there's a term you hear, maybe more of a Vipassana, choiceless awareness. That's not exactly. You probably heard that term, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's almost more of a technique, almost more of a way of thinking what you're doing than a kind of state you attain, right? I mean, those are not the same thing, right? Those.
Yeah, I mean, Shikantaza is just a basic instruction that once...
it is an instruction, okay.
It's an instruction, but it's... once concentration is stable enough that the mind can just be still. And I don't mean concentration in the sense of I'm focusing on an apple and concentrating on it. I mean just concentration in the sense that the mind can just simply be still and not get caught by everything that arises. When that can happen, then what we say in Zen is just let that be that. Whatever arises, just let it arise and fall away. Whatever arises, let it arise and fall away. Do not make decisions. In other words, you're relinquishing volition. You know, and this sounds like you're doing nothing, but actually, what's happening is that slowly erodes self, because the self is essentially volitional. There isn't a self that does something. The sense of separation that feels it needs to manipulate the world and be volitional is separate self. So that process is what needs to slowly quiet down. And whereas the other forms of meditation give that process something to do, Shikantaza gives it nothing to do. Okay.
You know, one other thing associated with Zen, in the popular mind certainly, are koans. And I mean, they work independent of meditation, of course, but I think they're also supposed to work in synergy with meditation. And I know of Zen practitioners who have said they meditate on kind of explicit philosophical questions. Like they may think, who hears? You know, or in other words, what is it in you that's doing the hearing? Or who am I? Or, you know, these particular sayings are, of course, making you focus on the question of what really is in here. Where do you actually find this self that you're assuming exists? But of course, there's a whole range of koans, famous ones. One was sound of one hand clapping, and so on. Are those routinely integrated into meditation in Zen, or what role do these kinds of things play?
Well, there are two major schools of Zen. There's Rinzai and Soto. The Rinzai school is the one that you're thinking of that very formally moves through traditional koans. I'm from the Soto school, which does not. Okay, so we're familiar with those koans. We read them, we study them, but we don't have a formal practice of, okay, you come in and you work on the first koan until that's worked out, and then you come in and do the second one. That's Rinzai school. I don't feel that I have the insight to comment on how they relate those two. So, but I can tell you how we use koans. So the way we use them is more, Soto kind of has a sense that your life presents the koans you need to work on. So if somebody comes in and they might be meeting in a practice discussion with a teacher, And we come to a point where it's realized that there's a real sense that a behavior is happening because they're afraid of dying, let's say. The koan might be to just, I might suggest like, okay, what would it be to just sit in meditation and drop in, what if I die now? What if I die now? And just be with, or it might even be simpler, dying now. And just let that drop in and let that be there and sit there like a seed. And when you drop something like that phrase, which is quite powerful, then all kinds of things start to turn. You know, there are responses in the body, there's revulsion, there's grass, you start to see everything. And essentially what happens, you start to see the root of suffering in that particular instant. And it also may unveil to you many other things that you didn't expect. But in that way, that's the drop-in.
So in that case, would you kind of keep thinking the phrase, you know, not enunciate it vocally, presumably, but using it as a kind of a subvocal mantra?
I don't know that you would do it as, you could most certainly do that. For me, it wouldn't be so insistent in that way. I mean, I wouldn't say it over and over. I would probably just drop it in and say, dying now, and then I would sit there quietly, and then, you know, 10 minutes later, if my mind's wandering or if I'm not feeling it again, I might drop it in again. You know, and I might just do this. It'll be different for different people, depending on where they're, you know, whether their mind's wandering or what's going on for them. Some people may really have to tie their mind to that phrase and say it with some regularity because their mind's drifting. It'll just depend on the person.
Yeah, if you look at the ancient texts on mindfulness, there's a certain amount of contemplating grotesque and unpleasant stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, like in your body, you know, feces and so on. Not all that often a part of you know, at least introductory meditation guidance, I find in the United States. Well, listen, this has been really interesting. I don't know much about Zen, as may be evident, and this is very illuminating for me, and I think I need to learn more. I mean, I do think, you know, the traditions ultimately align and kind of converge in their ultimate aims and philosophically, but it's interesting what different paths there are. So thank you, and keep up the good work. That's great work you're doing there in Brooklyn with the students. And maybe if you have time down the road, you come back and we can chat again.
That sounds great, Bob.
Okay, take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.